Hello and welcome to Elevate 2021. This session configuring the project object for PowerServer 2021. Hi, I'm Chris Pollock. I'm the Director of Developer Relations here at Appian. You can reach me at chris.pollock@appian.com or at the LinkedIn address as you see below my picture. I've been working with PowerBuilder for a long time. You can see here in 1989 I actually started with the alpha version of PowerBuilder 0.8. And that's because I used to work with Dave Litwack, the creator of PowerBuilder and InfoMaker, and Mr. Kim Sheffield, who actually wrote the original data window. In 1991, I started my own consulting company, and I've worked for a lot of different consulting contracts. We're talking major projects such as databases in the petabytes, number of users well over 10,000 concurrent. In 2016, I joined Appian as the Director of Developer Relations. I'm now responsible for course developer liaison, PowerBuilder courses, technical presentations, and of course support. Since I've been using PowerBuilder for many years, and PowerServer since it originally came out, got into it heavy in about 2008 when I went through the .NET version, and of course InfoMaker all along since it was created by PowerSoft. In prior roles to that, I was a database administrator, head of information resource management and data management at various organizations. I have lots of specialty in Windows internals, basically use almost every database management system out there, mainframes, minis, or on PCs. And of course, lots of programming experience in various languages. PowerBuilder, of course, the most predominant. And my specialty or forte these days is systems, technical, and application architectures. So let's have a look at what we're going to discuss in this section. First of all, an overview of the PowerServer 2021 architecture. How does it all work? How do the pieces fit together? Then we'll look at an assistant that's required called the Cloud Application Launcher. Where do you build it? Where does it reside? And how does it actually interact from the client or end user point of view? Then we'll look at the application to PowerBuilder server basics, PowerServer generation, client application to PowerServer mapping, PowerServer application testing, and then of course, how do you deploy what you've built to the various environments such as quality assurance, user acceptance testing, etc., all the way to production. What happens when you get to production? So let's look at an overview of PowerServer 2021. First of all, the good thing to know is everything revolves around the PowerBuilder IDE. You just need the Cloud Pro version of the IDE. From there, we're going to have a look at an existing client-server application. And then we need to build a new thing called a PowerServer project. The PowerServer project integrates with the PowerServer Toolkit. Notice that Toolkit is also installed within the PowerBuilder IDE. And it does all the handshaking between the existing client-server application and what you need to get built and deployed. So let's have a look at, first of all, the left-hand side, which is the web server. One of the things that has to reside on the web server, because your application is being actually deployed from the web server, we need this thing here called the Cloud App Launcher, or CAL. And of course, you need the good old PowerBuilder runtime. And we have the ability here within the IDE, handshaking with the PowerServer Toolkit, to actually go and build those two pieces and place them on the web server. Then you'll notice that when the end user starts the application, the first thing that's going to come down is the Cloud App Launcher. They're sort of like the three checkboxes on the right-hand side of the end-user PC. That's the first checkbox. The Cloud App Launcher checks to make sure that it's on the PC. If not, this little module, which is 5 to 10 megs, gets downloaded from the web server to the end-user's machine. Then, of course, the next thing it has to do is says, well, the application can't run unless the PowerBuilder runtime is there. So there's the second checkbox. Is the PowerBuilder runtime files there? And during this process, it also checks on the second and third launching, is there a new Cloud App Launcher? And have the PowerBuilder runtime DLLs been updated? If so, those get synchronized to the end user machine. And the third checkbox is the client application, but we're not quite there yet. So what happens here in the project? The PowerServer project allows you to build and deploy. One of the things it does, of course, is it activates the PowerServer Toolkit, runs through your existing application, takes all the different objects, and basically builds the application and deploys it onto the web server. The next thing that happens, however, during the build process is it actually scans through the actual PowerBuilder application, the existing client-server one, and it looks at all the inline SQL and the SQL inside the data window objects, removing those from the client application and building RESTful web services that are basically the PowerServer server itself. And it's built in .NET Core using C#. So the PowerServer Toolkit is basically translating the data access logic to C# code, which are RESTful web APIs. The next thing that happens is that, of course, during this process, the web APIs, the RESTful web services on the app server, need to communicate to a database management system. So there has to be some kind of database connection. So we have to inform the toolkit about that. And then once it's all done and the two sides have been generated, part of the application sits on the web server. And of course, PowerServer itself is an app server. In the older versions of PowerServer, that actually ran underneath your web server. So for example, it was a helper to things such as IIS. But now the new PowerServer 2021 is its own independent standalone server. So you don't have to worry about having a generic general app server available. It is its own app server when it gets generated. The next thing that happens is, of course, the user starts the application. So you notice now the interaction to the application is via that web server. So the left-hand side that you see here is really, from the web server's point of view, the PowerServer project function is really using Power Client to build the left-hand side. The Cloud App Launcher, the PowerBuilder runtime, package your application to the web server. And then, of course, the last thing that the end user does once the cal and PBR is down there is to bring the application down. So we're using basically Power Client to do this. So there's no change there. The difference, however, is that once the application gets running, that's where the big difference is here in the PowerServer model. Because what happens, of course, is the application no longer has any SQL. The data access logic is all in the app server. So what's going to happen here is a RESTful web service from the application is made to PowerServer itself, the data access logic, and then the actual retrieve, which is a select or update or delete command, is sent to the database. And that result set is sent back to the app server. The app server, in turn, is returning via the RESTful API call, returns it back to the application on the end user machine, however, as a JSON result set, because RESTful web services work in JSON. So the result set is converted from binary into JSON, and then at the end user machine, it's unpackaged and placed back into, for example, the data window primary buffer. Then the information is displayed on the screen. If there's an update, for example, then that command is a RESTful web API call back to the app server, which then gets converted into the appropriate DML for that database management system. And then what comes back, of course, to the end user application is just the return code. Yes, the update worked fine. And then it issues a commit, for example, if that's the end of transaction. And the app server then processes that to the database and then returns a OK or not OK back to the end user via the RESTful API return, which again is just a quick JSON result. So this is basically what we now call the cloud native architecture here in PowerServer 2021. Again, it's all driven from the PowerBuilder IDE. So there's not much new to learn. You're still using the same IDE. So let's look at the first step, building and deploying the Cloud App Launcher. So again, we go back to the PowerBuilder IDE and we need to deploy something to the web server. And that's the Cloud App Launcher. With the Cloud App Launcher, we're also going to tag the PowerBuilder runtime, because that also needs to be deployed to the web server. And then, of course, again, the first thing that's going to come down to the end user machine is that Cloud App Launcher. It's sort of like the traffic police officer, basically directing traffic. So the cal is basically doing that kind of mentality. And the second and third time you launch it, it says, okay, everything's there. The Cloud App Launcher is there. The PowerBuilder runtime is there. But has anything changed? Is there a newer version? Did you apply a maintenance release? So I have to bring in a new runtime DLL. So it goes through those same three checkboxes. The last checkbox is the application object, but we're not there yet in step one. We just need to build a cal. Notice the cal settings, which is the app launcher, gives you different locations of where the cal resides and where the applications are going to reside on the end user machine. So the tip here is when you're defining this, use relative folder location. Don't use a specific location. So each server will have one or more CALs and PowerBuilder runtimes because each one is tied to a different build and a different version of PowerBuilder. So for example, you could be using PowerBuilder 2021 for application A. You could be using PowerBuilder 2022 with PowerServer 2022, which of course would have a different CAL version and PowerBuilder runtime files for that particular version. So let's have a look here at a CAL demo. How to go about building this and deploying it to the web server. So here's the PowerBuilder 2021 IDE. You can see I'm using the latest build, 1311, which is the latest one. That's the first maintenance release. So under Tools, you'll notice that there's a new thing here called the Cloud App Launcher. So we're going to go here to upload the Cloud App Launcher. And there you can see the first thing is, well, where do I put this? It has to be on a web server. So one of the first things is which web server. You can define multiple web servers. If you want to add more, just add server. And you can define either a local, which I have already. So I have IIS running on my local PC. So in my C drive, I have inetpub/wwroot. And we can test that to make sure it works okay. If you want, however, we can go to a remote server. And again, you can give it whatever name you want. And the key is to fill in the host and the username and password for that FTP session, because that's how anything you upload from the PowerBuilder IDE is over to a remote server on a different machine. I'm not using a remote server at this point, but that's how easy it is. Just fill that in and then you can use that and it'll appear in the drop-down box. The next thing you have to do is define the launcher profile. So you can see here you can run it with a service or without a service. So the big distinction here is without a service, you don't have to be a local administrator on the end user client machine. Everything will run, the Cloud App Launcher and bringing all those pieces down will run without a Microsoft Windows service. So that's one way to do it. Or you can say, for example, that you're running with a service. However, if you're running it Windows Server, for example, 2016, 2019 or newer, running it as a service, it'll run as a background task in the Microsoft Windows operating system, and it'll allow you to basically run different threads on that main server operating system. Notice when you're building the Cloud App Launcher, you basically drop the runtime files onto the web server, which will get downloaded to the client machine itself. So do you want all the 32-bit or all the 64-bit or both to come down? If both of these checkboxes are done, both runtimes would be about 10 meg. If 32 or 64-bit only is checked, it's about a 5 meg size for the Cloud App Launcher. Before we do the upload, I want to point out here the Create button. And we can go here and we can specify, for example, that we want to use the runtime from, again, PowerBuilder 2021 build. So that's important here. The Cloud App Launcher is tied to this particular runtime. We can specify the path. It's going to be users app data. And that's where the Cloud App Launcher is going to be installed on the client PC. The title of the Cloud App Launcher. So we could make this personal, for example, ABC Corporation. And you can also specify your own icon so that when the Cloud App Launcher comes down and you look at it running as a background service, it seems to be more like ABC Corporation opposed to looking like Appian. For the advanced options here, notice that we can, again, run it without a background service or run it with a background service. So notice here, if you choose the background service, then you have to have local administrator rights here. If you're not running on a multi-threaded operating system of Microsoft Windows, then I wouldn't even bother to check that whatsoever. Notice that the applications are going to come down here based on %app data. Wherever app data is defined for that particular user, whatever drive and folder. Would you allow the end user to actually change the install path? Not likely, especially in production. But you can set that option on if you want. So you notice now at this point, we're actually building the Cloud App Launcher, specific runtime files for that. So this package is now ready to run. So now that it's actually built within the IDE, what I want to do now is upload this to the web server. So I just select the upload button. This usually goes very quick. So you notice here that the runtime is actually compressed, so for storage on the web server, and more importantly, for downloading to the end user machine because it downloads much faster as a compressed file. And there we have it. It's uploaded to the web server. Before leaving this section, I also wanted to come back here and mention that the Cloud App Launcher itself can be signed. So notice here that if you have Windows policies, or you have an antivirus which is very picky and is actually picking this thing up as a potential threat, what you may have to do is sign it. And that's pretty easy to do. You can see here I just pointed to the fact that I have the Microsoft Windows SDK. The signing tool is actually located in this path on my machine. And then you would point it to the certificate and the password and what kind of algorithm is used on it here. And it'll go ahead and it'll sign the Cloud App Launcher and make it more trusted by the operating system, and especially on the end user machines. So step number 2, that we have to do the application settings mapping. So again, let's have a look here in an existing client-server application. Now we've got the CAL installed at this point. Everything looks good. Now we need somehow to get to the existing client-server application. We need to package it for the web server. So again, we go back to the PowerServer project. This is just a new project type that interfaces with the PowerServer Toolkit to do all that for you. And of course, once that's done and everything's ready to go, then that application, which is now the third checkbox after the CAL and PowerBuilder runtime is downloaded and checked, the CAL is going to bring down the application from where it is on the web server. Notice that the application settings for the web server, deployment and execution are all controlled here with PowerServer Toolkit. So let's have a look now at the actual PowerServer project, a little demo to get the client side working. So coming back here to the PowerBuilder IDE, we would select New, and then we would go here to Project. And then of course you can see here the new one, PowerServer. Looks like a cloud with some dots in it. So this is a new project type. The first thing you need to do is give it a name. And the first tab page that you see here is very similar to what you do in the old native client-server application executable. You'd fill in the product name, the version, whether you want 32 or 64-bit or incremental compiles. You may use a PowerBuilder resource file. So this is all exactly the same. The only difference here in this tab page than you would see that the older projects is the ability here to encrypt all compiled P-code files. That there are some unsanctioned utilities out there. They will go into your PBDs and they will reverse engineer the source code. If you don't want that to happen because you have some proprietary algorithms that you don't want exposed to a competitor, then you can choose encrypt all P-code files, and makes it a lot more secure. You can't unscramble it. And I would suggest, and I've been doing that even back in PowerBuilder 2017, and to recommend that you embed a manifest from the IDE. It just makes your executable more trusted by the operating system. So for the rest of this session, I'm going to be using the sales demo application that comes along with PowerBuilder 2019-2021. You can see the sales demo application on the left-hand side in the system tree. I've already built a PowerServer project for these. Notice I have two of them, 32P, basically a 32-bit P code, or a 64-bit P code PowerServer project. So we'll just have a look at the first one, which is the 32P. I've given it a name, so Sales Demo Cloud 32P. Notice that I've basically gone and just like my blank project, I have embedded manifest, and I'm not encrypting any P code files. It does slow down the startup of the application. More of a security thing of whether you protect the source code or not. The next thing here is the libraries, and this looks exactly like the other client-server native executable project. Here are the libraries. They correspond, of course, to the libraries that you see here on the left-hand side in the system tree. So nothing new there. And again, I can attach a PowerBuilder resource file to any one of those, just like a standard client-server. What is new, however, is external files. This particular application uses the themes. So basically, I've gone here and I've attached the themes distribution packages, which are going to go to the web server. Notice you have two choices. You can distribute a package of files as compressed, or you can distribute them as uncompressed. Because the theme files have a lot of JSON, they have a lot of images, I've chosen to put it here under the compressed packages. It's just a case of create a package. You can give it a name, ABC, and then you go ahead and you can add an entire folder, or you can add files. In this case, I created the package called theme.json, and I went ahead here and added the folder as the theme folder that came with the PowerBuilder install. And that's all there is to it. Then you can see here on the uncompressed ones, I have some ability here to have a look at and deploy INI files, HTML, JavaScript, text files, even in third-party DLLs, or one that I created myself, for example, using Snap Develop that comes with PowerServer, PowerBuilder 2021. And again, XML files can be deployed as well. Any kind of file, actually. Notice here, when you're looking at DLLs, you have the ability here to control the DLL registration. Do you want these to be actually registered on the client machine? And then if so, just hit the checkbox. This one doesn't need to be, so I'm just going to leave it unchecked. Then you have an INI file here, and then you can specify for the INI the configuration, what happens when you actually deploy it. Notice here my default is to merge the update, so it'll compare the existing setup.ini to the current one that you're deploying, and if you have any new sections or values, it'll merge them in there. Or you could say, no, I just want you to overwrite everything that's out there, or I don't want you to update the INI file whatsoever. So you could have one that's static. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it as merge update. The next thing at the bottom here are images dynamically loaded. And you can see here that I've added different images for the dark theme and the blue theme. These are just PNGs. They could also be video files, MP4s, whatever you want. So you can add that. So again, I just created a folder. I call it image. And then I added files by adding the dark and blue images that came along with the themes. So that's all there is here for the dynamically loaded images. And then on the runtime, because remember the runtime is going to be also installed with the Cloud App Launcher, to make sure that your runtime is matching the build that you're compiling under. And again, you can verify that under Windows Tools, System Options. And you can see here of the different builds that I have. The IDE for this particular application is set for PowerBuilder 2021, and I'm using build 1311. So if I have different applications, let's say, for example, I have application A, which is under a different build, I can say when I'm using application A, I want to use the runtime build 1288. For this particular application, this is application B, I want to use build 1311. So the IDE can be of a static value, but we can use different runtimes. So you can control the runtime here in the Systems Options dialog of the IDE. That was new in PowerBuilder 2019 R3. So all I have to do is verify here in my PowerServer project that that is the correct runtime that I want to use. The base DLLs will automatically be calculated. You don't have to check anything down below. However, you may be using some advanced features, which my particular sales demo is. It's using the web browser new control. It's also using the ribbon bar. So I just check the extra things that this particular application is using, and it brings those DLLs down to the web server, and then from there they'll be brought down to the actual user's application machine. And then, of course, for signing, just like we could sign the Cloud App Launcher, we can also do the same thing here. We can specify the sign tool to be used. And again, if you, like me, have the Windows SDK installed, you just point it to the sign tool, which is signtool.exe, location, specify a certificate and a password, and away you go. It'll sign it for you. If you're using a third-party signing tool, then you can choose the one at the bottom. You could do the same thing for the Cloud App Launcher. And again, it just makes your application executable more trusted by Microsoft Windows and, of course, the antivirus systems. At this particular example, I'm not going to bother to sign it. And then client deployment. So this is where we map to the web server. Notice at this point, we have the ability here to map again to a local web server. And you can see here that I can go here, edit. I'm mapped because my IIS is installed locally, so it's inetpub/wwroot. And I can test to make sure that that's working okay. And that looks good. If I want to, however, I can add a remote. And I can give it a name, and then I can fill in the host, and then the password, username and password, and of course whatever port that the FTP server is running on that particular machine where that web server is running. So if you're going to use this, then you have to have, of course, the FTP services running on that remote machine where the web server is. And then you can test the connection. If everything's okay, it'll add it to the list at this point. If you forgot to upload the Cloud App Launcher, which we did here from the other dialog I showed you earlier, you can do it from here as well. So now we know exactly where the application is going to be deployed to. We can specify a release number for it. So it could be available, for example, from September 1st. So we can make it basically expired at the end of this year, which is December 31st. And we can specify time as well. You can go ahead and you can create multiple applications. They can have different deployment versions, and each version can have an available and an expiration time. So you can go ahead later on and create another PowerServer project deploying, for example, the version 1.02 available from January 1st of 2022. Expires, for example, maybe June 31st of 2022. Download all the application files as necessary or download them at startup time. So the first one, for example, only pulls the files down when your application references them. This one here, of course, pulls them down all at once. So that slows down the startup, but once they're down, that would be it. The startup here is, again, without a background service, which is what I would highly recommend, unless you're going to a multi-user operating system, then you want to start up with an OS Microsoft Windows service. And then whether or not you want to deploy here as Auto HTML, which is another way of starting the Cloud App Launcher. And then the run options here is any command line arguments that you want. You could have nice guy equal to Chris, for example. And that will be passed on the DOS command line, which of course is available in the open event of the application. So these are static command line arguments that get passed in. If you want, you can also do dynamic arguments, and you can have a combination of static and dynamic arguments as well. So the next one here is whether you want to show an animation when the application runs, and do you want to validate the application integrity. Now this is different than we had encrypting the P-code file. So what this is saying is all the files, whether they're executable, dynamic libraries, INI files, text files, HTML, whatever, all the files can go against an application integrity check, which means that the Cloud App Launcher will compare the CRC on each file to the actual web server file CRC. And if there's any differences in the cyclic redundancy check, CRC, that means that the file has been tampered with, then it'll stop the application in its tracks and say, hey, somebody's been messing around with this thing. You can also specify whether or not you want a desktop shortcut and a start menu added, and if so, whether or not you want to put an uninstall shortcut on there. So these are all optional, whatever you prefer. The shortcut name here, because I did ask for one, is going to be Sales Demo Cloud. And if I want, I can specify, again, 32p. And whether or not I want an icon associated with that. The next thing you have here is a preload event. So when the application comes down, do you want to actually execute something? Sure. Maybe I want to run, for example, fonts.bat file. And that's basically going to execute this file. Make sure it's in your list of external files here at the top on that tab page. And then this bat file, for example, could install some fonts that are used for producing barcodes, for example, or some special fonts that your application is using. So you can see here that in order to start this application, so this is where the end user would type in localhost / sales demo cloud app 32p, and that'll actually run it from localhost. I'm not running certificates. If I did, I could say HTTPS, for example, and have a certificate enabled at this point. Also, I can specify a port. If you don't specify it, of course, the port is 80. And then whatever other arguments you want to pass to the application. The thing here is the app will run from the Cloud App Launcher. If you don't want that, you can always specify the user has to start it from the web browser. It's not running in the web browser like PowerServer 2020 and below. It's actually just the way it gets started. So I like the Cloud App Launcher because then I can just go here and I can use the desktop shortcut. Okay, so let's look at the PowerServer generation side of things. At this point in time, we've scanned through the existing client-server application. It's been deployed to the web server, along with a Cloud App Launcher, and the PowerBuilder runtime. But now from the client's point of view, we need to go into the client application and we need to remove the data access logic. What we're going to do here, we're going to ask the PowerServer Toolkit to replace inline SQL and data window SQL with basically RESTful web APIs, which we call the data access logic. In order to do this, the PowerServer Toolkit is going to need a connection to the database. This is important that you install now the 32-bit driver for whatever database management system you're going to interface with during this generation, because the PowerBuilder IDE is 32-bit So we need 32-bit access to that database, because what's going to happen as it scans through your client application, it's going to compare the SQL to the actual database schema that the target is for. And as long as the application SQL matches that schema within the database, then everything will be okay. So you have to make sure that you're pointing to the same database. It doesn't have to be the same instance. It just has to be an up-to-date schema in development, which reflects what's in production. So the next thing that happens is if everything balances and they can verify that those tables and those stored procedures exist, it'll basically remove the data access logic from the client application and basically build the .NET Core C# data access logic, which is really PowerServer itself. This is automatic. You don't have to do anything here. It just does that automatically during the build process. And of course, what's left on the client side are data windows that have no SQL. The retrieve, for example, is a RESTful API call. The update is a RESTful API call. Commit, for example, and the rollback just becomes a RESTful web API call. So the key is that the development database, again, as I said, must match the production schema, or the schema that you're pointing to is a subset of what is actually out there. So as long as I can verify that DML at that point, data manipulation language. So let's have a look now at the PowerServer side of the project demo. So returning to the project painter for the PowerServer project, the only thing we need now is the last one, which is the Web API tab page. So at this point, you just need to give the solution a name. And again, this is used just for the .NET Core solution generation. You can give it any name that you want. And you can specify the namespace, same thing. You notice here that we can also use an authorization service. So besides the basic authentication, we can go here and use basically a level of authentication above and beyond. As you can see, JWT can be used, authorization, Cognito can be used, or any third-party service that's not here. These are just templates that you can specify. I don't have authorization set up. That's normally what I use. So again, do you want these settings automatically overridden when we deploy the project again and again? You can specify yes or no. The main thing, however, is that where are you going to locate PowerServer? So PowerServer is running on localhost, and I'm basically saying generate PowerServer.NET Core application to listen on port 5000. The next thing that's going to happen here is you're going to come down here. The first time is going to be empty. Then I can say auto import. And this license that comes down here is a developer's license. So basically it's a 5 connection license for PowerServer. It doesn't limit the functionality. It's just, as it says here, a developer license. The other important thing is, how is PowerServer going to connect to the database? So we're going to go here. You can see that I've already set up some things here that I have a cache name, which is sales. I'm using ODBC, and it's going to the demo database that comes with PowerBuilder 2021. And how I map the application, I go down here to cache name, and I say SQLCA, for example, commit using SQLCA, set transaction object in the data window, for example, to SQLCA. Then PowerServer is going to say, I need to access the database via this cache name, sales, which is up at the top here. If we're going to add more, for example, we create a default profile here. I would add a new profile, and I'll call it SQL Server, for example. Then I'm going to go here and I'm going to create a new cache. So here I'll just call it SS here for SQL Server, and I can go down and choose SQL Server. I'm running SQL Server here, so I'll just say localhost. And I'll use SQL Server authentication. I'll log in as SA, type in a password. And then if everything's okay and access is granted, I should see the databases. I'm going to connect to my own database, and then I'll test that out. And everything's okay. Now notice at this point, every time the PowerServer connects to the SQL Server database engine, it's going to log in as a system administrator, basically God. At this point, you may not want to do that. So that's where this checkbox comes in. Allow dynamic connection. Basically, it'll pick up the login ID and password from the SQL transaction object itself and pass that into PowerServer to be used to connect to the database. So now the user's authentication is being used, not the one that we just hard-coded. So now you see we have a cache name. It's Microsoft SQL Server. It's pointing to Chris database on this particular server. And now I just go here to the bottom here and I say new, and I specify SQLCA. So you notice now that I've actually mapped SQLCA to the cache name SQL Server, which is pointing to that database. I could hit OK. Now in the original version of PowerBuilder PowerServer 2021, which is build 1288, it would just take it at this point. But notice now that in this new build, 1311, they've added one feature here. You need to make sure that the driver is there. So it gives you a warning at this point. It can't go any further. So I need to go to database drivers. That's a new command button that you would see here in this particular build. And you have to specify that you're using the SQL Server driver. You can check out the license if you like. Basically authorize the fact that you've read it and you're happy with using that NuGet package. And then if you hit OK, it'll actually bring it down for you. So this is how you basically would map SQL Server or Oracle. Again, you would add a new profile. Under that profile, you would add a cache name, and then you map SQLCA to, or whatever you call your transaction object in your application, to whatever cache name. So in the default one here that I map to SQL Anywhere, and then I have one here for SQL Server. So when you're happy here with your mappings, you hit OK. And that would basically be it. And you can hit the save at this point. And now your PowerServer project is ready to take it to the next step, which is the build. So this is how far we've gone at this point. We've actually got the client piece. We've got the Cloud App Launcher and the runtime ready to go on the web server side. We've got the mapping to the database access logic because we understand how that PowerServer is going to be compiled into the .NET Core C#. We also understand how the connection to the database is going to happen. So let's have a look here at basically the mapping, building, and testing at this point. So once we go here and build and deploy, and everything's ready to go, we'll be able to actually specify to the web server from our web browser how to connect to the application. That's going to bring down the Cloud App Launcher and also the runtime. And if they're already there, then the third checkbox that you see on the right-hand side of the end user machine is the last piece here, which is actually bringing the client application down. Remember, at this point, the client application has no DML. The data access logic has been removed. But it knows, for example, that data window number 1 on a retrieve accesses RESTful web service number 1. So that mapping is already done at this point by filling out all those tab pages. So we basically just need to go ahead and do the actual build and deploy. And once that's done, then we can actually test to make sure everything works out well. So here's the mapping and then the testing, which is basically the mapping has been done. We need to then follow through with the build and test. So coming back to the PowerBuilder IDE into the sales demo PowerServer project, everything's ready to go. Notice that the PowerServer toolbar is available to you here in the second toolbar when the PowerServer project is open. The second icon from the left-hand side is Build and Deploy. So now it starts that actual building. It also scans the SQL. So you'll see here in a second, it'll actually scan through the SQL statements. There you can see the data windows being parsed. The SQL is being converted to RESTful web services. You notice now that the actual objects are actually being parsed. In PowerServer deployment, the objects will be actually physical files. There's no PBDs anymore. Here you can see the SQL actually now being parsed, and it's being checked at this point against the database schema. So you can see here that the Cloud App has been published successfully here in the output area. We've got this message and we're ready to go. So that's the client side, and the .NET C# code for .NET Core has been basically generated. So we need to go to the third icon from the left-hand side, which is compile and run the web API. Now, so we're going to compile this into a .NET code. So if I click on that, which database profile do you want to use? I want to use the default, which is SQL Anywhere, and I'll hit OK. So you notice here in the bottom left, no warnings, no errors. So the actual compilation of the .NET C# PowerServer server itself is OK. In the development environment, what happens next, it automatically starts a DOS command console. And then you can actually see the PowerServer starting itself. So here we have PowerServer, and it's up and running. All the messages are green, which means everything has been built correctly, your license is okay, and we're ready to go. So the next thing is to actually test the actual application itself. So you have two ways to test the application. You can say run the PowerServer project right from the IDE, or you can see what it looks like from an end user's point of view. So let's do the end user point of view. I'm going to type in localhost, and then the actual name that I deployed the application under to the web server, which is Sales Demo Cloud 32P. So you can see here at this point, it says it's trying to open the Cloud App Launcher, because remember the cal has to come down first. So I'm going to assure that's no problem, because the first step we need to do is to download that and install it. Next thing it does is it checks the PowerBuilder runtime. The application startup animated Windows logo. And then the application starts itself. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to minimize this. And we're going to take the web browser out of the picture because I don't need it anymore, so that you can actually see the actual PowerServer itself. Now again, this DOS console is only in the development environment. And this is useful because then the developer can see what's happening as far as the interaction between the client application and the server. So the client is up and running, but if I go to address here, for example, notice here you can actually see the PowerServer responding in the log as different things are being pulled in. And then you can see here, for example, we can go to customer. And again, you can see PowerServer responding. Those are the RESTful web APIs, the data coming back from SQL Anywhere being packaged into JSON, and then you can actually see the data being dropped into the primary buffer of the data window. So everything is transparent here, and it seems to be working just fine. So you notice here on the address, I've got a miscellaneous command button, which I didn't really want to do. So what happens here if you want to actually update the application? And within the Person PowerBuilder library, we have a user object called address. And under layout here, I'm going to remove that miscellaneous command button, which I put there on purpose because I made a mistake, but I wanted to show you that what happens if you change the application. Once you've done that, you're going to go back to that same project, and you're going to basically regenerate and redeploy. This is going to be faster because it's an incremental deploy and build. So the deployment is done. We're just going to compile that. Again, this is incremental, so it'll go much faster. And now I'm going to show you what happens if you start the application from the actual PowerServer project toolbar, which is this icon right here in the middle of the PowerServer Toolkit. You'll notice here it should just start the application. That would be the same thing as you're running the desktop shortcut or from the Start menu. You notice there's no prompt now for the Cloud App Launcher. Sees what differences have happened and only brings down the differences, because remember, each one of these objects, the user objects, the menus, the data windows, are now separate files. So it just does a CRC check, and it just says, oh, you changed that one user object, which was the address. You'll see the PowerServer interact. Or if we went to products, for example, you'll see PowerServer interacts as well, and the data comes back in a JSON result set. So basically, we've done the actual build, deploy, and now we're testing. So PowerServer considerations for deployment. Deployed to the web server in your development environment is the application. It's supporting external files, cal, and the PowerBuilder runtime. And we need some way of moving it to a different environment. We can use the remote web server approach, because you could go into the project and you can find and say, hey, I want to be able to deploy that to a remote server. That may be good from development to user testing. But for systems testing or user acceptance testing, and definitely for production, I doubt whether a developer would have access to those other environments. So one of the nice things you can do in the PowerServer project, there's the ability here for a packaging option that you can use. So let's have a look at that now. So going back to the actual project itself, you can see here deploy directly to server. We can say, no, I want to package this as either a zip file, or I can package it as an installer executable. And you want to put the Cloud App Launcher in there, and you want to also put in the PowerBuilder runtime file in this install package, which is really nice. Now you can hand it to the QA people, You can hand it to your operations personnel, and they're the ones that can put it in production. So the next thing is PowerServer itself. Would you have access to put PowerServer into any one of these environments that you see here in the bottom right-hand side? Maybe QA, but I doubt anything else, especially in production. So again, we can actually just copy the C# executable that's been built. So you can just copy that executable and supporting folders to the next environment. The other thing you can use is Snap Development, because you have the ability here to actually publish from the Snap Development IDE. Snap Development is free. It comes with a cloud edition of PowerServer 2021. And we can use other kind of packaging tools, for example, Docker or LCX if you're on Linux. So once those packages are done, they can be run and installed. So because PowerServer itself is now just an executable, the only thing you have to have on the application server, besides installing the actual package here from the developer environment, is the .NET Core runtime. So that has to be pre-installed on the server. And then you just install a package, and then you basically start it up, and away you go. Just a little note on the left-hand side, by the way, you can use the brand new PowerBuilder Auto Build utility, and it can actually build both PowerBuilder, Power Client, and PowerServer projects right from the source code manager. So this is new. If you use the older PowerBuilder external compiler, PBC, you cannot do PowerServer project. The next thing, however, is how about you publish it? You may want some more documentation. So one of the things you may want to do here is to visit Appian documentation on this particular URL. So if you go to that URL, in my case, it launches my favorite browser, Firefox. Going to that URL, you can see here there's all sorts of information here on how to publish a web API. And there's different tutorials on how to do it as well. Last thing, when you get into production, you've got everything there on the production web server, and then you have PowerServer running on a production app server, and then connected to your, of course, your production database server. But there's a couple of different things here, because the application is going to come down to the end user, but it's mapped to the development environment. We want to be able to change that in production. So once you install the packages, we need to basically say, well, what happens here in the production mapping? We may want to change some client and some PowerServer settings. So one of the things we want to do here is the ability to customize the deployment. And we may want to do that for the client. We may want to change things such as external files, change the web API itself, which will be definite because most likely the PowerServer production is actually on a different machine, listening on a different port. And we may want to actually change the database connection, user ID, different password, for example. Notice at the bottom of the tip, inside the web server, inside that package, there is a DLL called customize-deploy.dll. It was actually generated for you by the PowerServer project from the PowerBuilder IDE, but it's a .NET based DLL. So you basically say .NET and pass it some arguments. So for example, -URL. Change the URL to 172.16.171 in the client application, and make sure that it tries to communicate to PowerServer on port 5009. Notice that this customization utility is in the web server. It basically updates your client side of the application. There are more parameters as well that you can change. So have a look at the documentation. But that's all you need to know in order to handle the client side. However, what happens on the production side? For example, you could connect to a different database, different server. You have different launch settings, for example, and change the port. So how would you want to be able to do that? On the development side, use Snap Development. You can see these files, applications, server, and JSON. Notice from the PowerBuilder IDE, Snap Development is an icon right on the main toolbar now. So we're just going to click on that first. So you can see here when Snap Development starts, it opens the Solution Explorer. We're mapped to the sales demo application. And then you can see here, for example, launch settings. We can have a look at applications.json, and we can have a look at server.json to be able to control different things. For example, applications controls the database. So you can see here we're connecting to the cache name sales. Well, in production, that may be different. It may be connecting to something else called sales production. So we can change it here. If we go to server.json, there's the license key. Now, this is important to note here for the production people because You have the development license key and code at this point. So what you need to do is you need to contact Appian Sales, and you need to have a production license. And they will give you a new license key and license code. You're going to replace that with a production version. The only difference, however, just controls the number of connections. The launch settings control the port. So for example, you can see here that localhost, for example, 5000. Well, in production, this could be, abcprod.com:5099 could be the port. So you can change that URL. Instead of a DNS name, for example, that I just made up, you can use an IP address, : and then the port number. But you also see all the C# code, so you can look at the RESTful APIs, and you can get those APIs, and you can call them from anything else. It doesn't have to be a PowerBuilder application. You can call them from an ASP.NET application as well to do that data access logic. So again, you can reach the Appian community through YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and of course, the Appian community web, where you have all sorts of discussions, training, tech articles, videos, questions and answers that you can see other people have asked that may be pertinent to what you're trying to do as well. In the Elevate 2021 live session, we'll have an active question and answer time slot. Thanks so much for watching.